I must say, I love those modest introductions, but it's a particular pleasure, and I want you to know how much I enjoyed listening when I joined all of your stories, and it's a pleasure to be back. Let me begin by saying that I was greeted by a friend the other day who asked me, "Didn't you used to be John Rothmann?" And the answer is, I'm still the same guy. As Susan recounted, the unexpected demise of KGO was a real blow, not to me, but to San Francisco. For those of you who are longtime San Franciscans, you know that KGO has been the billboard for individual comments, for discussion, and really just an amazing vehicle. I am not, how do I say it? I'm sorry that I'm not there every night with all of the news taking place. And so I really want to thank all of you for having me this morning, because I have so much to say that I'm not able to say on the air. I don't know what my future holds. There has been a lot of speculation, and I hope to return to the airwaves if the opportunity presents itself. All right, enough about me. Let me get directly to the issues this morning. I shall try to be concise, and I shall try to leave plenty of time for questions. Let me begin by two words: seditious conspiracy. As you know, yesterday a verdict came in dealing with Mr. Rhodes and his group, which proves conclusively that what happened on January 6th was an attempt to subvert American democracy. On the air, somebody referred to it as treason. I said, no, it's sedition. It is sedition, the undermining of American democracy. For those of you who wondered whether or not there would ever be a day of reckoning for Donald Trump, the answer is it's coming. It's coming, and it's going to come with full force. It is not something that we should rejoice in. The tragedy of Donald Trump and his administration will certainly be revealed in the days to come. I do feel vindicated, I must say, because many of you who've known me and listened to me in many forums know that my criticism was never a personal criticism. It had to do with what I felt was a betrayal of the presidential oath of office. 35 words to defend and protect the Constitution of the United States. And he failed to do that and continues to do so. So let me just say very quickly, for those of you who are critical of Merrick Garland, he did exactly the right thing. He proceeded judiciously, carefully, precisely. And those of you who are watching events unfold, not only what happened yesterday, but what's going to happen in Georgia, and the fact that even the Supreme Court is now speaking out, Donald Trump is going to have to reveal his taxes, which is a whole other issue. There's so many levels. But let me just say, in conclusion on this, it is a challenge for the Republican Party. Many of you know that for many years I was a Republican. I was a longtime president of the Teenage Republicans in San Francisco. I served on the staff of Richard Nixon. I ultimately became a Democrat because, like my old boss, Milton Marks, I couldn't stomach what was happening in the Republican Party. But I hope that this will require the Republican Party to purge itself. And may I be clear that Mike Pence's comments about Donald Trump and the fact that he would have supped with a Holocaust denier, an anti-Semite, and still try to justify doing that is, to me, absolutely incomprehensible. For many years, you will remember I was president of the Zionist Organization of America, and they, about a month ago, gave a gold medal to Trump for all of his good work for Israel. But I'm delighted to tell you that Mort Klein, the national president of the ZOA, who was born in a DP camp and whose parents were survivors, had the good sense, although he's a Trump supporter politically, to denounce what the former president did. May I say, just as a moment as a Jew, to tell you that the idea that a former president of the United States would sit down with a Holocaust denier and a clear Jew hater — I don't use the term anti-Semitism, I believe it should be clearly defined as Jew hatred — is absolutely appalling. And I'm glad to see that within the Jewish community, even those who may have in the past supported some of the Donald Trump initiatives in the Middle East are now waking up and really seeing what this guy is. Okay, let's put Donald Trump aside, except to talk for a moment about the Republican Party. Donald Trump is running again. He is clearly the favorite for the nomination. I will predict, stick my neck way out, I don't believe he will be the nominee. There will be others who are going to contest, including Governor DeSantis of Florida. I don't have a lot of admiration or even respect for DeSantis, but he is clearly the alternative at this moment to Donald Trump. Mike Pence, with whom I have never agreed on any political issue, was a profile in courage on January 6th. He personally, I think, is responsible for preventing the sedition which the Trump people were attempting to do. And I think Mike Pence, although I'd never vote for him, deserves the Profile and Courage Award because of his actions. Let me say quickly about Liz Cheney. I, again, would never vote for Liz Cheney. I disagree with her on too many issues, but she deserved, and I'm proud to say I helped nominate her for the Profiles and Courage Award, which was presented to her by the John F. Kennedy Library. Are there good Republicans around? Those of us who are old-time San Franciscans remember George Christopher, Milton Marks. We remember Earl Warren, Goody Knight. We remember people in California who were Republicans with tremendous integrity, and one can only hope that that will be restored. Now, a quick word about Nancy Pelosi. No real surprise in her decision to retire as Democratic leader, Speaker of the House after the defeat. I'm glad she's staying in Congress. She's done a great deal for San Francisco. No matter what you think of her politics, she has been an advocate for this congressional district, and I expect she will continue to do so. Hakeem Jeffries will be, and I predicted this, many of you know, quite some time ago, will be the next Democratic leader in the House, and he's a very able man and a whole generation removed. The Democratic leadership, with the retirement of Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, not from Congress, but from their leadership positions, open up an opportunity for the Democratic Party to really get going and trying to produce a solid base. Let me say a quick word about Congress. Kevin McCarthy. Kevin McCarthy has a very narrow Republican majority. He has a problem because 20 members of his own caucus have said they will not vote for him for Speaker. So for those who believe that Kevin McCarthy is a sure thing to be Speaker of the House, let me tell you, the next few weeks are going to be absolutely fascinating in terms of how he adjusts to the far right that he has to cater to in order to win. I will also advise you to take a hard look at Jim Jordan, who will be the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. He is promising investigations into everyone from Joe Biden to Hunter Biden to Dr. Fauci, and it will go on and on. What is interesting to note, and I want to really commend this to you, in one of the greatest upsets in American political history, the Republican Party was defeated in its quest to control the United States Senate. Some of you who listen to KGO and some of you who listen to me since on various commentaries know that I had every confidence that the Democrats would retain the Senate. I have to tell you that was pure speculation on my part, but it's always nice to be vindicated when you said the right thing and, in fact, a victory takes place. The fact that the Democrats came within a handful of votes of controlling the House, also an indication. Let me quickly tell you that Joe Biden, a lot of people speculating about whether Joe Biden will be the Democratic nominee for president. I can't tell you whether he will or he won't. I just don't know. He's 80 years old. As some of you know, he has achieved a great deal as president, but can he continue for another, 6 years, essentially, were he to be reelected? You will note that Gavin Newsom, our governor, has pledged to support Joe Biden for election in 2024. But if Joe Biden backs out, would Gavin Newsom run for president? The answer is he and Kamala Harris will have to work that out. The idea that we would have two people from California, both major contenders for the nomination for the presidency of the United States, is not unusual. You may remember the days of Bill Nolan, Goody Knight, and Richard Nixon, when we had three California rivals, not to mention Earl Warren, although he was then Chief Justice. When that happens, you have to make an agreement that one bows out in order for the other to succeed. Remember, you cannot have a ticket of Newsom and Harris or Harris and Newsom because you cannot have two candidates for president and vice president from the same state. You'll recall that when Dick Cheney was nominated for vice president, he had to move from Texas to Wyoming to establish his residency in order to run on the ticket with George Bush. So this also will be a very interesting dynamic. The problem both political parties have are the extremes in both parties. And I say that about the Democrats on the far left, the so-called squad, and the Republicans and their Marjorie Taylor Greens and Getzes and so forth. Richard Nixon once said to me that in a political primary, the Democrats run to the left, the Republicans run to the right. But in order to win the election, you have to run to the center. The person who gets to the center first probably wins the election. Dick Nixon was right about that. And we'll see how all of this plays out. Now, if I can, let me shift to foreign affairs for just a moment. A number of you have mentioned what is happening in China. I want to address China. I want to address Iran. And let me begin with those two. What we are witnessing is an unprecedented moment in world history. The fact that in China there is a rebellion taking place. It has to do in part with the restrictions put on because of the virus. But let me point out to you, this transcends that. Will the Chinese leadership survive? I can't tell you. I'm not a predictor of the future, but I can tell you that the Chinese understand that their society has been completely turned upside down. And so this is going to be a fascinating moment for them. Same thing in Iran. I have friends who've just come from Iran. The protests continue unabated. You will recall that in 1979, such protests caused the fall of the Shah of Iran. The difference, if I may be so bold, the Shah had cancer, knew he was dying, and also made the statement, brutal dictator though he was with the Savak, that he would not turn his army on his people. He was not prepared to shoot his people to stay in power. Had the Shah done that, he would have survived. The difference in this situation is that the current Iranian government appears willing to turn force on their people in order to repress them and prevent a revolution. Again, these are two areas of the world of tremendous instability, and we've got to watch it carefully. Quick word about Ukraine. The far right of the Republican Party is talking about putting some sort of check on the money we send to the Ukrainians. Let me be crystal clear on this. Ukraine is battling for its freedom. I'm not a great fan of a lot of what happens in Ukraine by the Ukrainians themselves. But what they are fighting for their own freedom. And nobody should be surprised about that. Years ago, when I lectured at Colorado College, there was a member of the faculty there, long deceased, who was a Ukrainian nationalist, who explained to me that given the opportunity, Ukraine would demand its independence and its freedom. That's what we are seeing now. We are seeing the West, that is, the United States and our allies, NATO, and the European Union, put in a very difficult spot. Winter is coming. Remember Napoleon and remember Hitler. Remember what happened when they encountered the Russian winter. This doesn't work for the Russians and it doesn't work for the Ukrainians. It means we are now looking at a prolonged war of attrition. Can there be a compromise achieved? I'm asked that all the time. And the answer is, to be honest, I have no idea. I think the Ukrainians are not going to surrender to what the Russians want, which is the submission to Russian superiority. This has tremendous implications for Europe. Let me remind you, the largest operating nuclear plant is in Ukraine and is now under assault. Are you aware that they're giving out iodine tablets because they're afraid that there could be another nuclear disaster? Are you aware that the United Nations has said clearly and precisely that this represents the greatest danger, not only to the Ukrainians and to the Russians, but to the Europeans? It's not only a matter of power, it's a matter of what would happen if there were a meltdown. And remember, having that water there is going to be critical so that the plant does not overheat. I always think of 3 Mile Island and the implications there. Is there a solution? No. But I can tell you this. No matter how history judges Joe Biden in a variety of ways, his weaving together this powerful alliance, including our NATO allies and including the European Union, has been a spectacular foreign policy success. Some might say, not particularly Joe Biden's credit. Maybe it happened because of the circumstance, but can you imagine if Donald Trump were president of the United States? Let me go back to the impeachment of Donald Trump, which involved his situation with Ukraine. Remember what he said at the time? He wanted dirt on the Biden family. And that was one of the reasons why he got stuck in that. History is going to judge the Trump administration harshly. And I have to tell you, they opened the door for what has now happened in Ukraine. So that is another element. So between Ukraine and Iran and the European Union, there are real issues. I want to say a word about, well, cryptocurrency. I just heard the discussion and I was intrigued because we spent Thanksgiving in the Bahamas. That's where that crypto collapse ultimately took place. I can tell you the impact on the Bahamas will be minimal, but I can tell you housing prices, it was fascinating for me to hear this from friends of mine in the Bahamas. They had neighbors, for instance, who were very much involved in that, who lost everything and who just left their home and vanished. The implications economically are profound. And you are seeing this ripple effect now economically across our own economic structure. I was asked to say a word about what's going on with the layoffs, the massive layoffs in high tech. I'm not surprised at all. Not surprised. And by the way, going back to the question of cryptocurrency, some of you will recall we had a producer at KGO, a lovely young man, who put all of his money into cryptocurrency. And you will recall I put him on the radio and we talked about it, and I explained to him why I had doubts. And I had the same discussion on an airplane ride coming back to San Francisco. I asked, what backs up cryptocurrency? And he said, mining. And I said, mining? Mining for what? What is it that holds up cryptocurrency? And I felt the same way whenever I think about any Ponzi scheme. Now, I can tell you that the implications of this are real and that there will now be talk about some federal supervision of the cryptocurrency market. It's not going to go away, but I also want to suggest to you in the strongest possible terms, there will be now some sort of move for federal supervision of cryptocurrency. I was asked why I believe in the dollar in contrast. What backs up the dollar? It's not silver, it's not gold. It is the full faith and credit of the United States. And whatever anyone thinks about our own economic problems, and I just heard the latest report.
He's talking about cryptocurrency and US dollar. You might want to.
I'm sorry, somebody interrupted me. Let me just be clear with you that the full faith and credit of the United States is because we are the most powerful economic engine in the world. No matter what problems we have in inflation, you'll see the numbers this morning. We did a lot better economically than people thought, despite inflation. Let me address quickly, if I can, and somebody tell me if I'm going on too long, so I want to leave time for questions. I want to address some issues here in San Francisco. I feel very strongly about this, and I want to do it. Last night, the Board of Supervisors voted for killer robots. I understand the power of technology. I also understand our need to understand, and Rich Carrillo, who is here, could probably address this better than anyone. I know that the police department isn't perfect, but I trust human intelligence. I don't trust all the time our technology. My phone upstairs went out. Why? I couldn't tell you. But it's technology. Technology sometimes fails. Had I been a member of the Board of Supervisors, I most assuredly would not have voted for killer robots under any circumstances. I want to say a word about the action in San Francisco dealing with safe streets, and particularly the ballot measure which we had dealing with the Great Highway and John F. Kennedy Drive. I understand, because I traveled the world a lot before the virus, the need for open space and the need for bicycles and so forth. But I want to suggest to you that unless we take into account that not everybody is young enough to get on a bicycle, and I don't say this against our colleague here who is so concerned about bicycles, but not everybody here can walk long distances. Not everybody here, well, that's why we have handicap parking, which is another tremendously abused aspect of what happens here in San Francisco, and I'm sure everywhere else. I am very concerned about that. I'm very concerned about the approach we take. I had Brooke Jenkins on several times before my departure from KGO, or KGO's departure from me, if you prefer. I wish her well. I don't think it's an easy situation to be district attorney in this city, but clearly the people spoke loudly and clearly on that issue. I am hopeful for the future of the city, but I want to also say a word about a ballot proposition that was voted on by the people to move our local elections to presidential election years. Those of you with long memories remember that one of the reasons why they were in odd years is because the sense was that you could then pay closer attention to local issues. When we have the ballot in 2024, which will include a long list of issues, we will also be electing a mayor and our local city officials. I am concerned that that passed because it will take away the opportunity to spotlight local issues. And I feel very, very strongly about that. The fact that Mayor Breed has an extra year, I'm using her as my example, I hope and I believe that in 2024, there will be an active competition for mayor of San Francisco. And London Breed will then be judged on what she has done and not done. But I don't know whether or not what we've done is to close the door on a real local attention-getting campaign. I know that I want to give you plenty of time. What time do we break, President Tony? At 9?
Well, you can go. We've got about 10 more minutes before 8:30, so you've got at least till 8:30, and till 8:45 if you need to go
Okay.
that way.
Well, what I'm going to do is I can go on and on. Trust me.
Yeah.
But what I really want to do, if it's all right with you, is throw it open for questions. I will try to address them concisely and quickly, and that way you really have time to interact with me.
Okay, that sounds good. So we will open the door for questions. Do we still want to keep recording with the questions, John? Or
Yes, absolutely. Let people have that opportunity. No
Okay.
question about it.
All right, so we've got Janice Litvin raised her hand, and then anybody else raise your hand virtually or start waving.
And don't worry, if they don't raise their hands, I can filibuster till 9 o'clock. Don't worry.
That's right. All right, go ahead, Janice.
Thank you so much, President Tony. And thank you so much, John, for coming back. I apologize for staying off camera. I'm in bed with a bad sore throat and cold this morning, so you won't see me. But what I really want to know is, what is the future for Roe v. Wade?
It's a very serious question, and I want to address it directly. I believed when the Dobbs decision came down that there would be a reaction that would be overwhelming in the process. A lot of people said, no, the economy is the #1 issue. The economy is certainly an issue. I don't want to dismiss it. But the right of a woman to choose, and please note, I'm not saying the right of a woman to have an abortion. I'm talking about the right of a woman to control her own body. Became the dominant issue undercurrent in this campaign, which is why so many Republicans went down to defeat. There are real questions, and you know that the United States Senate last night voted to ensure not only the acceptance of same-sex marriage, but also interracial marriage. It was in part, if I may be so bold as to say, a cosmetic gesture. I don't know that it's really going to have an impact. But there is no doubt that when we vote for a president, we vote not just for a president, but for a court, not only the Supreme Court, but the district court and the appellate courts. And when Donald Trump was running for president, and he said, I am going to appoint justices who will reverse Roe v. Wade, people laughed. And I said, no, no, no. You're not just voting for a president. You're voting for the future of the right of a woman to choose. Are we going to be able to reclaim that right by the Supreme Court? Not as it is currently constituted. When you read Clarence Thomas's comments, and he opened the door to the rescission of same-sex marriage, I was horrified, and I am still horrified. For me, it's a very simple question. Shall individuals have the right to choose? And if, as a man, somebody mandated that I have a vasectomy, losing control of my own body, I would fight it with every ounce of energy and strength that I have. I feel the same way about a woman's right to choose. Once you have that right, then you can choose whether to have an abortion or not. But without that right, you are locked in. And so I believe that was a real reaction, and I think the Republicans sort of got it. But you will note in this vote yesterday in the United States Senate, there were still, I think it was 36 Republicans who voted against that bill. And that upsets me. You remember who the last pro-choice Republican leader was? Jerry Ford. And I remember vividly in 2004 at the Republican National Convention, the last convention that Jerry Ford and Betty Ford attended, they were interviewed. And Jerry Ford turned to his wife and said, "You know, Betty, I think we're the only two pro-choice Republicans in this hall." And it was a sad commentary. One other quick comment, if I can. When on the ellipse, on January 6th, Donald Trump Jr. said, "This is no longer the Republican Party. It is the Trump Party." And Republican leaders didn't stand up and say something. I was horrified. The fact that the Republican Party had no platform in the 2020 election, but simply said whatever Donald Trump wants, that's our policy, was to me shocking, disturbing. And I say that as a former Republican. Some of you remember the debate over the Vietnam War at the Democratic Convention in 1968, or, which by the way, I have a full recording of that, and I listen to it periodically just to remind myself what it was like when you had real discussion. Or you may remember the Republican National Convention of 1964, where the debate on extremism was expressed so vigorously. I always remember Governors Rockefeller and Governor George Rothmann, and they're being booed. I was there that night, never forget it. But at least there were debates, there were discussions. And I think the Republican Party had better open up, or we will have a problem because we won't have that two-party system. Now, you might wonder how that relates to the question of women's right to choose. Once upon a time, there were two wings to political parties. There was a left and a right in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Well, all of you know that if you clip a wing on a bird, the bird can no longer fly. And what is happening in our political process, hurtful to both the Democrats and the Republicans, is that there is no longer a liberal Republican or a conservative Democrat who has real sway in their political party. That is a tragedy for the American political system.
John, the last time you spoke to us, you spoke very strongly about problems you saw in the city.
Yeah.
And since then and now, you've had a little change in the career trajectory. And so, and just moments ago, you said that you felt that there would be competition in the upcoming mayoral race. Is there a possibility that John Rothmann will be among the contenders?
I never rule anything out. I want to point out that 2024 is not 2023. I have 2 years to consider, and we have to consider where the city is, what will happen, how it will move. But certainly I am a firm believer that I leave all doors open. And if there is a Rothmann for mayor campaign, you will be the first to know. But I want to remind you, just so you're all clear, I was mayor of San Francisco in Youth in Government Day in 1966. The best run day in the history of San Francisco. But all options are open. And I appreciate your question because a lot of people have asked me the same thing, and we'll see. We'll see.
Thank you, John.
John,
Sorry, we have a question from Tim Durkin in the chat. Could you comment on North Korea? Is there a succession starting with Kim's sister or his daughter?
It appears that Kim is setting up his daughter. She's now getting that kind of exposure. North Korea is a real problem. And one of the things that Biden has done, which is correct, is to work with the Chinese, despite all of the internal dissension and so forth, on trying to contain North Korea. But the Chinese are as worried about North Korea as we are. Remember that North Korea is a nuclear power. And if you have been following what has been going on in the last few weeks, they've been constantly firing ICBMs. Indeed, the Japanese were so worried that in that part of Japan where the ICBM fell in the water, but nonetheless near, they went on real alert. North Korea is unstable. I might add the same thing applies to Iran, where they are in full pursuit of a nuclear capability. One of the things that scares me in terms of the international arena is the proliferation of nuclear technology and that it falls into the wrong hands. And everyone here listening should be aware. So when you ask about North Korea, that is my real concern. And if you think we're worried, you have friends in Seoul and South Korea, they are very concerned because of the potential aggression. So these are all issues. Look, I've not said a lot about Vladimir Putin and Russia, but that's a serious problem too. You ask about succession in North Korea. Let me ask you about succession in Russia. When Khrushchev was removed in 1964, Brezhnev and Kosygin stepped in. They were part of the Politburo. And when Gorbachev was nearly overthrown in August of 1991, we understood that in the end, he survived because he had the backing of the army. What happens if something happens to Putin? And I don't know how many of you heard the report yesterday, but the Russians are now magnificently moving to develop a further nuclear arsenal. These are all things that must concern us. I'm a great optimist. I'm not a pessimist. I really believe that we overcome all of these sorts of things. But all it takes is one mad person, and we could have a nuclear conflagration. Let me just quickly say the new prime minister of Israel will be Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm just reading his autobiography. It's a new book. It is one of the best books I've ever read. I have to tell you that, and I've read a lot of books. It's just superb. It's called Bibi, My Story. And I can only tell you it explains a lot about who he is, what he does, how he does it, whether you agree or disagree with Benjamin Netanyahu. But I can tell you one clear statement. If Iran moves toward that nuclear position, Israel will stop it. And Benjamin Netanyahu has made that crystal clear. And I've known Bibi for many years. And I can tell you that when he says he will not stand for it and Israel will not stand for it, he is joined in that view by his opposition. That is to say, the Lapid and Gantz, the people who are leaving office. There is a national unity because the Israelis understand what the South Koreans understand, that one nuclear weapon dropped in Tel Aviv or one nuclear weapon, low grade, not talking about massive, we're talking about a Hiroshima type bomb, hitting Seoul or hitting Tel Aviv, and both nations would be severely crippled. They wouldn't be eliminated, but they'd be severely crippled. One of the great tragedies, and some of you know I'm Harold Stassen's biographer, and I'm quoted whenever the United Nations does something, they ask me to say a few words about Governor Stassen, who was part of the US delegation and who really authored the United Nations Charter. The failure of the United Nations, founded here in San Francisco, is a great tragedy. It is important that the United Nations exist. It is important that the General Assembly meet. It is important that I hope one day there are certain revisions made. Governor Stassen proposed a series. Remember, you can't change the UN without the agreement of the 5 Security Council members who have veto power. They have to agree, and that will never happen. China, Russia, the United States, Britain, and France. So the charter is basically locked in. But I hope the United Nations continues, and it is a very important international forum. And if there is one agency that we should keep our eye on, it is the IAEA. And the IAEA has been in Ukraine dealing with that nuclear situation. They are certainly looking into Iran and what's going on, and the fact that the Iranians have violated every norm on this. They are moving to escalate their nuclear expansion. Remember, there is a reason behind this. Whatever internal dispute there may be in a country, if the leaders of that country control the nuclear arsenal, they have an ace in the hole that nobody else has. So that's the reason why we tread so carefully with North Korea. That is why we are treading so carefully with Iran. And that is why the value of Israel dealing with Iran and the European Union and NATO dealing with the crisis in Ukraine is so critical. So I throw this in, and I'm glad the question came up. It's a very complex question. Let me just say one more thing. It matters who's president of the United States. It does. Question of temperament and judgment and the ability to deal with issues. And whatever you think of Joe Biden, even at the age of 80, I would say that when history judges him, just based on these 2 years, he's going to receive very high marks in relation to foreign policy. He's kept balance, he's kept unity, and I think that's very important to consider. And what comes after Joe Biden is a whole other question. Next question.
All right, I've got a question asked by the audience. Is California blindly Democratic, or does it vote Democratic due to a lack of good Republican candidates people can support regardless of party?
It's not blindly Democratic. Take a look at the Los Angeles mayoralty election, where you had Karen Bass win, running against a man who had been a Republican and was now a Democrat. And I think he became a Democrat in order to run. I have to tell you, I want a vital, vibrant two-party system. I yearn for the days when here in California, we had a Earl Warren, Goodwin Knight, Richard Nixon, when we had a George Deukmejian and a Pete Wilson. Not that I agreed with them on everything, that wasn't the point, but there was a viable opposition. I sort of played a trick on my class at the prom, and I asked the question, who is the Republican nominee for governor of California? There was a deafening silence. Nobody really understood who he was or what he was. I think it has to do with the fact that good people do not join the Republican Party here in California, because there's no chance of winning. And I think if you're a Republican, and we saw that in this recent race where we had an independent running for state treasurer and he lost. I want to see a vibrant, vital Republican Party. I do. Not because I'm a Republican ideologically anymore, but because I want, as Barry Goldwater once said, a choice, not an echo. And I think that is something we need to work on. Once upon a time at the Golden Gate Breakfast Club, when I first spoke to the club 40 years ago, 50 years ago, whenever it was, there was Alan Nichols, who was the Republican county chairman. There was Emily Pike. There were Harold Dobbs, Milton Marks. There were elected public, Cap Weinberger. There were people in San Francisco who were moderate Republicans or liberal Republicans. Chuck Frankel. I mean, there were incredible people. And unfortunately, that doesn't exist. So, this is a real challenge, which needs to be taken up by those of us who care about San Francisco. There needs to be inclusion, and there needs to be the Republican Party. If I were in charge, some of you remember, they invited me to speak some years ago to the Republican County Committee, and I gave a talk at the Tonga Room at the Fairmont Hotel. And it was all the Republicans gathered together, and I gave them a history of the rise, the fall, and the collapse of the Republican Party in San Francisco. And the one thing I said to them is, I'm not a Republican anymore, but I want you to be a vital, vibrant force. And unfortunately, that is not the case. And that's a tragedy for all of us.
All right. Bert Hill has a question, then I have some from the audience after Bert.
Yeah, I want to go domestic to Mayor Rothmann. PG&E manages our electrical grid in San Francisco. It's an investor-owned utility.
Exactly.
An investor-owned utility means that they are guaranteed a profit so that the investors get paid back. So the prices are secondary. The main thing the PUC does is ensures service, not necessarily a good buy in that. And this investor-owned utility primarily sells gas, a gas that we're trying to eliminate over time to get rid of. So we've got a company that sells gas, is guaranteed to be protected economically. Should we be able to buy out PG&E, transfer to the San Francisco PUC the infrastructure, which has been tried to do $2.5 billion twice now. If you were the mayor, would you support that changeover because the PUC will be tied in to climate change directly?
That presupposes something, and I want to be very clear about this.
Okay.
The integration between the PUC and PG&E is absolutely unacceptable. You find a lot of PG&E people going to the PUC, and the PUC has not been a functional operation.
Right.
Unless that can be straightened out, you can't solve the problem. Am I in favor of a separate utility? Let me be very blunt with you. PG&E has failed. We have a choice. Either we reform PG&E and the PUC plays a role in that, or we do go independent. The costs, as you know, are staggering. This is no joke. So were I in a position, whether as governor, as mayor, as any position, the first thing I'd work on is the PUC, because that has to be reformed. The PUC's job of oversight has completely failed. And all of us who are involved in this understand that. My distinguished colleague, Pat Thurston, who, by the way, is starting at KCBS as an anchor tomorrow night, a very limited role, but she has really gone into this extensively. And you might want to invite her to come and speak just on the question of PG&E. But that's my answer to you. I know it is not as precise as I wish it could be, but if we were sitting down one-on-one, first thing I do, reform the PUC and make sure that there's a complete separation between PUC and PG&E, because you can't have the body that is supposed to be supervising be so well integrated into it. So I know it's only a partial answer, but that would be one of the first things I would tackle for sure.
Okay, I feel a little bit differently in it. The primary work is subsidizing all the fire stuff all up north, and we're
I don't disagree with you. I just can't go into it in great depth. We don't have time.
Yep.
But you're welcome to call me, and I'll be happy to listen to you.
Okay.
And explore it with you.
All right,
That's
great.
it.
I've got a question from the audience here. Marshall from Arizona says, we're gearing up for building microchip factories, 2 in the pipeline. It makes me think the US is anticipating that China will take over Taiwan. What is your take on the matter?
Well, the first thing is we have a firm commitment to Taiwan. If you watch what's going on the South China Sea and you understand what China has been doing there and essentially building islands, what you're expressing is real concern. We have a commitment to Taiwan, what was once known as the Republic of China. And some of you will remember one at the Golden Gate Breakfast Club. I can remember this vividly years ago. It was Chinese New Year's, and the question was which flag would be hosted on the various buildings in Chinatown, the flag of the Republic of China or the People's Republic of China. You can remember the vigorous discussion in Chinatown in those days. My own suggestion is we need to be more independent and decisive in terms of microchips. We are dependent on what is coming out of Taiwan. We can't afford to let it go. Tried to buy a car lately. In the old days, you went into your garage and you tinkered with some, and now you can't do that anymore. You can't fix your car the way you used to. We used to have auto shop at Washington High School, where I am proud to say I remain president of the Alumni Association. I'm going to serve another 1.5 years, and I'll retire after I've served 50 years as president of the association. And we raised an endowment, as many of you know, of about $4 million for a public school. But we used to have an auto shop. How do you do an auto shop now? You really have to then understand the way the whole chip system works. So I'm in favor of our being as independent as we can be. If something should happen with Taiwan, we'd be completely screwed. Forgive my language, but it's true. And that's the reason, one of the reasons why we're so committed to them. And we should be. Should we go to war over Taiwan? That's a question for another discussion.
All right. Thank you, John. Next question is, will gerrymandering ever be fixed?
The answer is no. Look, Jess Unruh once said that as all of you know, the mother's milk of politics is money. And gerrymandering has a lot to do with that. And no matter how you gerrymander, look at the so-called supervisorial districts here in San Francisco. Just take a look at it and you can see. Many of you know I've been in favor of going back to citywide elections for a long time, as I've continued to favor citywide elections from the Board of Education. It's not that a supervisor Well, let's deal with gerrymandering. On a state and national level, it's very tough. You know that in the congressional races here, and you can take a look at a state like North Carolina, or you can take a look at a state like Florida or New York, what happened in New York. The gerrymandering is terrible, but it's part of the political process. And if I were able to solve the problem of gerrymandering, I would be receive the Nobel Prize in something. So all I can tell you is, no, we're not going to solve the problem of gerrymandering. But one more thing, I had intimate involvement in that when Milton Marks chaired Senator Marks chaired the committee on redrawing districts. And I watched what happened. And some of you who have real memory can remember when Phil Burton designed a district for his brother John to ensure that John would be reelected. Now, John chose not to run for reelection and Barbara Boxer took the seat. But let me just point out to you, gerrymandering is part of our institutional function, for good or for bad.
All right, thank you. Next question from the audience. How many illegal aliens have crossed the southern border since Biden took office?
Too many. And I would point out to you that applies to every administration. I listen, by the way, I listen to Fox very carefully. I learn I suffer from low blood pressure, so it really helps me to know. By the way, I was delighted to hear that Herb Gold is doing well. To the dentist, give Herb my love. He's a great guy and an old friend. Let me try to summarize this as best I can. We live in a situation today where, well, look, this is a complex issue as well. I want to see a system that works, not that fails. And how you reform a system, whether it's PG&E or whether it's redistricting or all the rest, they're things you can't just address so simply here. I don't know if that answered the question, but at least I tried.
All right. The next question is, unfunded public pensions is a huge problem, but politicians who benefit from the pensions approve the pensions. Can this conflict ever change?
No. How many of you listening to the sound of my voice live on a pension? The last thing you want is that pension taken away. One of the things I learned when I worked the overnights on KGO is there were two subjects which people would talk about with great willingness. One was guns, and the other was the question of Social Security. You may know that in this last campaign, and I think it's one of the reasons the Republicans lost the Senate, is Rick Scott, who is the chairman of the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee, suggested that Social Security be made voluntary and that there be cutbacks in entitlements. And I have to tell you, it did great damage to Republican candidates in state after state after state. And when Rick Scott challenged Mitch McConnell for the leadership of the Republicans in the Senate, he lost. I think most Republican leaders understand that you cannot talk about eliminating Social Security. And the same thing applies with pensions. Will there be revisions in time? No doubt. Certainly, those of us who were told when we were kids that if you worked hard, you'd have a guaranteed pension, you'd have a pension from your company. That doesn't exist anymore. My pension comes from my union because I'm a member of SAG-AFTRA. I also get my health insurance through SAG-AFTRA. By the way, you'll notice what the Republicans have taken off the table. They're not talking about repealing and replacing Obamacare. You can't. It's the same thing now with Social Security. So what happens with these pension funds? It'll be very interesting to see. God forbid there should be a real collapse. And that goes back to the whole question of cryptocurrency and the question of an unstable economy. All of us can remember what happened when we have economic collapses. And a lot of my friends who went out on margin on their stock accounts were profoundly hurt. And I don't know how many of you put all your money in Enron, but I know people who did. And so I am a great believer in diversification. And that means in my portfolio, you will find real estate, you will find stocks, you will find bonds, you will find securities, mutual funds. I mean, because there's got to be diversity. Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's right. One more question. Can a power grid that supports EVs be created in the near future, or will we face rolling blackouts to support electric vehicles?
I love the question because I have an electric vehicle. I could pick up my computer and show you my Leaf. It's right here in the garage, and I have my own plug-in, which is great. Although when I had a problem because my wife wanted to park a car and I had to go plug it in, I went up to the old Sears Target and I tried to plug it in up there because they're all on. They have their own kind of system. Well, let's be clear. The world is changing rapidly, and I don't think we're talking about rolling blackouts if everyone gets an EV. I hope not. But I do think our energy is important, and may I also say that applies to water as well. I didn't make that as a pun, water and well, but I can say to you that the water crisis here in California is incredible. I recently spoke with a gentleman who still favors eliminating Hetch Hetchy, restoring Hetch Hetchy to its natural beauty. I said, oh, really? And how do you intend to replace Hetch Hetchy? And he went through a whole series of machinations. And I finally looked at him and I said, are you nuts? Thank God O'Shaughnessy created Hetch Hetchy. And thank God it exists, because that's where we get our water, which is just about the purest water you can ever find. But we have a serious problem. If you live in Southern California, or my relatives, my niece and her family who live in Arizona, they're facing a real crisis of water. Maybe the time has come, if we can move oil, petroleum, and gas by pipeline, maybe we'd start to think about moving water from the East Coast to the West Coast, to the dry areas here. We're about to have a drenching beginning, I understand, late this afternoon, tonight. It won't be enough. And those of us, well, let me just tell you, I put in a walk-in bathtub because I didn't want to put in a hot tub, but putting in a walk-in bathtub, you don't have to do all of the things you have to do because you put the water in and you let it out. I haven't used my bathtub in 18 months. And I spent a lot of money putting the damn thing in. That is, my wife put it in. And the question is, why? Because I'm so concerned about our having enough water. I want to be able to turn on the tap and have clean water. Look what happened in Houston, Texas. Not to digress, but are you watching what's happening? So when we look at San Francisco, whether it's PG&E or our water sources or our infrastructure, haven't even touched on the question of infrastructure here in San Francisco. I can't solve the problems of the world. I can identify them, I can talk about them, I can philosophize about them. But here in San Francisco, we have immediate problems which need to be addressed by our municipal leadership. We're a city and county, and by God, let's hope they do their job. Are you telling me, Mr. President, that my time is up?
I am not. We almost up though. We're almost to 9 o'clock, but we got one more question. I don't know if this is actual thing or not, but if interest rates on the national debt goes up 3%, what will be the effect?
It would not be good. But let me be clear. I'm going to say something that may shock all of you. The conservatives who came up with the idea of a penny tax, which was pushed very strongly, I'm not opposed to that. For every dollar, 1 penny should be contributed to pay down the national debt. That's the beginning of the process, because when our interest rates on our debt are growing at such incredible rates, we're in big trouble. So people ask me about borrowing. I do everything I can not to borrow. I do everything I can to live within my means. I try to do everything I can to encourage my children, both of whom are very successful. We had a family meeting after I lost my job, and we were discussing who pays the bills. And I said, well, gentlemen, it's very clear. The person who makes the most money in our family pays the bills. And I'm delighted to tell you they pointed at each other. So these are all issues that are immediate. Let me just conclude by saying, I love coming to this Breakfast Club. I enjoy the intellectual stimulation and the challenge of your questions. Continue doing it, and please be aware that anytime you want me to come, I am not only happy to do it, but now that I'm not on the air, you are my therapy. And the great thing is I don't have to pay a psychiatrist I can come directly to all of you and I feel much, much better. So thank you. And I look forward to the day, I hope in the not too distant future, when we can actually be together and I can have another great breakfast with all of you. Thank you all very much.
All right, thank you, John. Look forward to you becoming a member of the Breakfast Club in the near future. And thank you for showing up today and enlightening us on a lot of issues. And thank you, everybody, for the excellent questions that we had today. I think that was really good. So I appreciate everybody. I am going to have to step away myself for a moment. You guys can chat amongst yourselves. Patricia, would you handle managing this? I'm just going to step away because I have to make
That's all right. You don't have to explain.
Yes, thank you. I'll be right back.
Patricia, could I ask John if he'd join us at the Sausalito Yacht Club tomorrow night at 6 o'clock?
You know, it's very thoughtful. I am not doing those kinds of public events. I have so many friends that have now come down with COVID that I'm just being overly cautious. And that includes my teaching at the From. I do it by Zoom. It's the reason I assume we're meeting that way this morning. It's not that I'm antisocial. There's nothing I would rather do than, as an old politician would say, but press the flesh and have an opportunity to speak. But I appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to the day when I can accept without any question.
Very well, thank you.
Patricia, it's Betty. John,
Yes.
she can't talk. John, thank you for your fabulous comments. Quick question. With all of the work that has been done with the commissions regarding Trump and the sedition, et cetera, now with the change in the House, what happens to all that work? How much longer do they have to make anything else happen, or is it a stop?
No,
Please.
it's not a stop, and I'll tell you why. The January 6th committee is going to issue its report. They do not have the power to bring any criminal charges. The point is that they will refer everything to the Justice Department. I again want to tell you, the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, is superb. He is meticulous. He is careful. He is going to take under advisement everything the committee sends to them. Already we're seeing, I didn't talk about Georgia, where members of the president's staff are now being required to testify. There's no executive immunity on this for testimony. I think Donald Trump is in deep, deep trouble, but I'll tell you what is great, and I'm glad to be able to say this. At the height of Watergate, and I worked for Richard Nixon, and many of you know I left Nixon for many reasons and was one of the first to call for his removal from office. And yet we remain friends, as all of you know. He always understood my position. He used to tell me, Johnny, if you run for political office, I'll support you or oppose you, whichever will help you most. The one thing I learned in the Nixon years is that in the end, the system worked. The courts, the Congress, the executive branch, the press, it worked. And the great thing about Donald Trump is when all is said and done, this American system will work. He will face his comeuppance. By the way, somebody asked me, you want him to go to jail? The answer is no. I use the example of Warren Harding and Eugene V. Debs. Debs was put in jail for sedition during World War I. And on Christmas Eve, 1921, President Harding, a conservative Republican, granted clemency, not a pardon, but clemency, which allowed the conviction of Debs to stand, but allowed him to go home. My prediction is that in the end, Donald Trump will not see jail time, not for these federal crimes. I think he'll be granted clemency. And as an American, I feel the same way about the pardon of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, believe me, suffered as if he had gone to jail. I mean, people do not understand the anguish, the agony that he went through. Okay, he recovered a certain amount of public stature and so forth, but the system works. So my answer is a very blunt and clear one to you. And that is that in the end, the American people will understand, and the beginning was yesterday, with a conviction for sedition. Sedition. And who do you think was responsible for summoning the mob and frankly, turning them loose? It was Donald Trump. And don't think that Merrick Garland doesn't understand that. And by the way, you better understand that Donald Trump and his supporters understand it too. That is, his key aides. And Mike Pence, whatever you think of Mike Pence, and I'm just beginning his autobiography, whatever you think of Mike Pence, what he did that day ranks as one of the great moments in preserving American democracy. And I say that as someone who would never vote for Mike Pence. I'm glad you asked the question. I'm delighted to answer it as vigorously. My only regret is that I'm not on the radio. I'm hoping that maybe if KCBS goes to a talk format, there's a lot of talk about that they'll call me and give me a shot again to do it. And I would do it gladly. Those of you with friends at KCBS, you can let them know I said that. That's why I'm so thrilled Pat Thurston is there, even though she's just doing news reading. Maybe they'll open it up for us. It's important for the people of San Francisco, but frankly, I count this, and I said this is sort of therapy for me, being able to talk about these issues bluntly and clearly and give you my thoughts, I hope benefit you as much as it benefits me and my mental health.
Yeah.
Yes.
John, I just finished reading Malcolm Nance's They Want to Kill Americans. And the idea of the sedition, the groups that have been listed by the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Correct.
On so many levels, it is frightening to me. Certainly, because one of the groups that is the Jew hatred. And for those of you that don't know, John wrote an article for our local J, the Old Jewish Bulletin, where he said we must stop using the word anti-Semitism. It's nothing more than Jew hatred. So I have adopted that because that's what it is. And when you listen to those groups and the sedition and the treason groups, and it's not just the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys and et cetera. And interestingly enough, for those of us about women's equality, of the 5 people that were convicted yesterday, 1 was a woman. So we are having equal opportunity, even as breaking laws. But I have to also say that I am very concerned. I listened to the clips from Fuentes. He was applauded at that group that he spoke to for the things that he said. It makes me scared. I may live in the Marin bubble, but please tell me how scary I should feel, because it's very frightening.
Yeah, I'm scared. I'm worried about it, but I have to tell you something. I'm not afraid to walk out my door. I was not afraid on the air to talk about these issues publicly to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in the podcast. I am proud of who I am and where I come from and what I believe in. And I oppose bigotry, whether it applies to Jews or Asians or Catholics or Protestants, I don't care who it is, or African Americans. We have to stand together in opposing bigotry. That was the lesson of George Washington. The fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene or Paul Gomer may have a major seat at the Republican table in Congress is, to me, absolutely appalling. And the Republican Party will pay the consequence of that, I believe. So yes, it worries me. We can give to bigotry no sanction, whether it is on an international, national, or local level. And so I want to be very clear about that. It worries me as a Jew. My father, I would remind everybody, fled Nazi Germany in 1936. My mother's family came here in 1850. I've had the experience of both being the son of somebody fleeing because of persecution, and of course the benefit of also growing up in a family of immigrants. So it worries me, but when I'll really worry is when I can't walk out my door feeling secure and safe. That's when I will really worry. Do I worry for American society? You bet. When I hear Donald Trump and Kevin McCarthy make the kinds of equivocal statements they make about bigotry, I'm appalled. I'm not a fan of Mitch McConnell at all. But Mitch McConnell understood and said yesterday, but he said it previously, that you cannot give bigotry this kind of license, and there's no room for it in the Republican Party. And he was very clear about his condemnation of Donald Trump. So I find it mind-boggling that a former president of the United States would lend credence to such bigotry, and then to say, well, I didn't know. Give me a break. Of course he did. And if he didn't know, he has no business being president or being a candidate.
Right.
And I'm waiting
The
for
fact
the-
that his son-in-law is Jewish means nothing
Well, you'll notice
to
that-
me.
Yeah, the deafening silence from the Kushners has been astounding. But look, these are issues that the Republican Party will have to deal with, and given the opportunity, if I have that public forum again, I will indulge in it fully. I guarantee you.
John, how about doing a podcast in the interim until something comes up?
I did that with Ed Baxter and Rosie Allen 11 years ago. And I did 3 commentaries a day. We were never able to monetize it. And I realized that and I talked about this with Mickey Luckoff, who many of you know is the president and general manager at KGO. In order for a podcast to work, you have to have a real platform. You have to have a platform like Amazon or one of the major companies. I just don't see it as a successful thing. Mark Thompson, my colleague, is now trying to do it, and I think he's having limited success. So I'm very pragmatic. I have a lot on my plate. I have a lot of activities that I'm doing, and if I'm going to devote time and energy, I'd frankly rather come to the Golden Gate Breakfast Club and have a chance to speak to people who are really right with it. If there were a way to create that interactive podcast, I'm still hopeful, perhaps, that there will be a forum here in San Francisco. And again, I say I would welcome the opportunity if they go to a talk format on KCBS. I would welcome the opportunity to do that, and I've indicated that to Jennifer and to Pat Thurston. So we'll see what happens. Time will tell. Fortunately, I have enough places to speak, whether it's here or the From, or I just spoke for the American Jewish Committee, for a variety of organizations who invite me to speak, and I'm always happy to do it.